The story of Spartacus's end does not begin on the battlefield, but in the silence before dawn, when the last breath of freedom still clung to the hills of southern Italy. He was not yet the broken gladiator the Romans hoped to display as a warning, nor the nameless corpse they intended to crucify along the Appian Way. In those early hours, Spartacus remained what he had always been, a man who defied empires. His eyes were red from sleepless nights, his beard tangled and coarse, his body marked by scars earned not for glory, but survival. And yet in that battered figure, the legions of Rome still saw a threat that had shaken the Republic itself. For nearly 3 years, Spartacus had led an army of slaves, deserters, and fugitives against the most disciplined forces the ancient world could produce. They had defeated praetors, humbled consuls, and embarrassed generals whose names once inspired fear. From the gladiator school of Capua to the icy peaks of the Alps, he had carved his legend in fire and blood. But legends, no matter how fierce, always find their reckoning. By 71 BC, the Senate of Rome had decided that reckoning must come, and they placed it in the hands of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, a figure whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. Crassus understood something that other generals had not. Spartacus was no longer simply a fugitive. He had become a symbol, and symbols could not merely be defeated. They had to be destroyed so completely that no trace of hope remained. The order he gave his men was merciless. Trenches were dug, fortifications built, escape routes cut off. An iron wall of Roman discipline slowly strangled the rebels. Thousands of Spartacus's followers deserted, some fleeing north toward Gaul, others surrendering in hopes of mercy. But Spartacus himself would not bend. Mercy was a word Rome had never shown him, and he would not give it the satisfaction of begging. On the night before his last battle, Spartacus gathered what remained of his followers. They were a weary, desperate band, hungry and ragged, but still bound to him by the memory of victories that had once made Rome tremble. Around the campfires, men sharpened blades that were little more than farming tools stolen from villas. Others kissed tokens from wives they would never see again. Some prayed to gods who had never answered. Others cursed those same gods for their silence. And Spartacus, standing among them, did not promise survival. He promised only that they would face death as free men, not as chained beasts. His words were not gilded by rhetoric. They were simple, carved from the truth he had always lived. Better to die in battle than to live in chains. At dawn, the final act began. Crassus's legions advanced like a machine, shields interlocked, spears ready, standards glinting in the pale sun. Dust rose in great clouds as tens of thousands of soldiers pressed forward in perfect rhythm. Against them stood an army less than half their number, a swarm of exhausted men armed with whatever scraps they had managed to hold on to. Yet when Spartacus appeared at the front of his line, sword raised, voice carrying above the clash of drums, a roar went up from his followers that shook the earth itself. It was not the roar of victory. They knew such a thing was impossible. It was the roar of defiance, of men determined to make Rome pay for every lash, every humiliation, every chain. Spartacus did not hide behind his men. He rode forward on horseback, pointing his blade directly at Crassus's command position. He did not care about glory nor about survival. His aim was singular: to kill the Roman who had sworn to erase him from history. Again and again he drove into the thick of battle, hacking his way toward the heart of the Roman line. Accounts tell of Spartacus cutting down centurions with the fury of a man possessed, his body dripping with blood that was not always his own. He was struck by spears yet tore them free. His horse was killed beneath him, yet he rose to fight on foot, refusing to fall. Men around him died in heaps, but Spartacus pressed forward, a storm of iron and rage, until at last he stood within sight of Crassus himself. But fate is rarely kind to men who defy empires. Before he could reach the Roman commander, Spartacus was surrounded. Legionaries closed in on every side, their shields pressing him into a cage of steel. His followers, desperate to save him, hurled themselves against the Roman wall but were cut down by pila and swords. Spartacus fought like a cornered lion, his sword rising and falling in a blur, cutting through shields, splitting helmets, leaving a trail of corpses in his wake. Yet even lions bleed. Wounds opened across his arms, his chest, his legs. The weight of numbers bore him down, and in that moment, Spartacus knew the truth he had always spoken. Freedom must be paid for in blood, and Rome would demand all of his. The ancient sources disagree on how exactly Spartacus died. Some say he was pierced by countless spears, his body torn apart where he stood. Others claim he was beheaded in the chaos, his head raised aloft to demoralize his followers. Still others whisper that his corpse was never found, that he vanished into the mud and blood of the battlefield, his body lost among the thousands who fell with him. But in every account, one detail remains. He died fighting, sword in hand, unbroken. No Roman chains touched him at the end. He denied them the triumph they so desperately craved. For the survivors of his army, death did not come so swiftly. Captured rebels were lined along the Appian Way, the great road from Capua to Rome, and crucified by the thousands. Their bodies hung for miles, rotting in the sun, a grotesque warning to all who dared defy the Republic. Each nailed figure was a story silenced, a dream of freedom choked into nothingness. Rome had crushed the rebellion, but it could not erase the memory of the man who had led it, and so Spartacus's death became something greater than Rome ever intended. They wanted to turn him into an example of futility, proof that no one could challenge their power. Instead, he became a symbol of resistance itself, a legend that whispered through the centuries. His body may have been lost, his followers slaughtered, but the terror of his final stand haunted the Romans who had faced him. They remembered the look in his eyes, the fury in his blade, the roar of his army as it met death without chains. Even today, when we speak of Spartacus, we do not speak of a gladiator who failed. We speak of a man whose death was more terrifying than the life of most kings. Terrifying not because of the pain he endured, or the violence of his end, but because of what it meant. That even in the face of impossible odds, even surrounded by the might of Rome, a man could choose to die free. That choice, more than any victory, was the wound he carved into history, a wound that time has never healed. When Spartacus finally fell upon that blood-soaked field, Rome believed the rebellion was finished. To the Senate, the matter was simple. A slave who dared to raise arms against the Republic had been defeated, and his followers reduced to carrion. But the truth was far darker, for what Rome did in the aftermath was not merely suppression, it was theater. A theater of terror, staged upon the longest road in Italy, where the very air stank of rotting flesh and despair. Marcus Licinius Crassus, eager to prove himself the savior of the Republic, was not content to declare victory. He wanted spectacle. He wanted every man, woman, and child across Italy to see what became of those who defied Rome. So he gave the order. The survivors, thousands of them, were to be crucified along the Appian Way, stretching from Capua to the very gates of Rome itself. It was not punishment. It was not even justice. It was a message written in blood and nailed into wood. Imagine the sight. Mile after mile of wooden crosses, each bearing a body left to rot beneath the sun. The screams of the dying echoed across the countryside, mingling with the cawing of crows. Mothers walking with children covered their faces, but the stench crept into their clothes, their hair, their memories. Merchants leading carts to market had to steer around the twitching legs of the crucified, their wheels crunching over bones that had already fallen. There was no escape from it. Rome wanted the horror to sink so deep into the people that no thought of rebellion could survive. And yet, within this grotesque display, the memory of Spartacus remained. The Romans had searched for his body, desperate to lift his severed head in triumph, to parade it through the streets as proof of their dominance. But they found nothing. Perhaps he had been buried beneath the corpses of his comrades. Perhaps his flesh had been torn apart until recognition was impossible. Or perhaps, as some whispered, the gods themselves had hidden his remains, unwilling to let Rome desecrate him. This absence unnerved the Romans, for though they had filled the roads with crucified rebels, they could not crucify Spartacus himself. In the Senate, Crassus was hailed as the man who ended the slave war, but the shadow of Spartacus lingered even there. Senators whispered that it had taken far too long, that the rebellion had made the Republic look weak. The richest city in the world, defended by the greatest army in history, had been humiliated for years by a man who had once been bought and sold like cattle. Spartacus was dead, yet his ghost stalked Rome's corridors of power, reminding them of their vulnerability, and Rome was not done with cruelty. Those who had once fought beside Spartacus but had managed to flee were hunted like animals. Soldiers raided forests, swamps, and mountain caves, dragging fugitives into the light. There was no trial, no mercy, only death. Villages that had given shelter to the rebels were burned. Families accused of aiding the slaves were executed in public squares. Rome sought to erase not only Spartacus's army, but the very memory of its existence. But memory is stubborn. Among the common people, the story could not be silenced. They whispered of Spartacus around hearths in taverns, in the dark corners of the city. To them, he was not merely a rebel. He was a man who had dared to strike at Rome itself, who had fought not for power or wealth, but for the simple right to be free. Parents told their children that Spartacus had never bowed, that he had died standing tall, sword in hand. And the more Rome tried to bury his name under fear, the brighter it seemed to burn. The most terrifying part of Spartacus's death was not the battle itself, nor the crucifixions that followed. It was the realization, even among his enemies, that he had changed something fundamental. Slaves still toiled in fields and kitchens, chained in quarries, bloodied in arenas. But now they carried within them the memory of one who had dared to fight back. Rome could crucify thousands, but it could not crucify the idea that men, no matter their birth, might yearn for freedom. The generals who faced Spartacus never forgot. Crassus, though victorious, gained little glory. When Pompey returned from Hispania and crushed the last fleeing remnants of the rebellion, the Senate credited him with ending the war. Crassus fumed, for he had borne the brunt of the fighting, but even he knew the truth. The rebellion's memory belonged not to him, nor to Pompey, nor to Rome. It belonged to Spartacus Julius Caesar, who at the time served under Roman command, is said to have watched the slave war closely. Though he rarely spoke of it in later years, some believed he carried its lessons with him, that the fury of the oppressed could shake even the mightiest empire. And long after Caesar himself was gone, the story of Spartacus still lingered, traveling across generations like a ghostly flame that refused to die. To understand the terror of Spartacus's death, you must see it not as an ending but as a beginning. Rome wanted him forgotten, reduced to a nameless corpse among thousands, but the absence of his body became more powerful than his presence. Legends spread that Spartacus had escaped, that he lived in exile beyond Rome's reach, waiting for the day he would rise again. Children grew up imagining the gladiator's sword still gleaming in the hills. His death became a myth, a wound that never closed, haunting Rome long after the crosses along the Appian Way had crumbled into dust. And what of the crucified? Their agony was not swift. Crucifixion was designed to break the human spirit slowly. For days, even weeks, the rebels hung in the sun, their bodies contorted, their breath rasping as lungs filled with fluid. Some clawed at the nails in their hands until their fingers snapped. Others begged for death, but the soldiers laughed, refusing them even that release. Ravens pecked at their eyes, insects burrowed into their wounds, and the stench grew unbearable. Travelers said that at night the road was filled with groans and whispers, as though the very earth had begun to weep. It was not just punishment, it was psychological warfare. Every Roman citizen who walked that road saw with their own eyes what defiance cost. And yet, within that suffering, the image of Spartacus's last stand grew larger. His men may have been broken, but their leader had denied Rome the triumph of capturing him. He had chosen his own end, fierce and unbowed, and that choice infected the imaginations of all who heard of it. Rome had intended to terrify, but instead it inadvertently forged a martyr. Centuries later, when empires rose and fell, when kings claimed thrones and lost them, the name Spartacus still carried weight. To rebels, he was a symbol of defiance. To rulers, he was a reminder of how fragile their power truly was. His death terrified not because it ended his cause, but because it showed that death itself could not silence him. Rome had all the power, all the wealth, all the armies in the world, and still it had taken years, countless lives, and rivers of blood to bring down one man who had once been nothing more than a slave. And so the image of Spartacus's death remains burned into history, A man standing alone amid the corpses of his comrades, wounds spilling his lifeblood into the soil of Italy, his sword raised against an empire. His end was not clean, not noble in the Roman sense. It was savage, desperate, soaked in mud and blood. But that was precisely what made it terrifying. For in that chaos, in that storm of violence, Rome revealed its fear. Fear of the man who refused to kneel. Fear of the idea he represented. Fear of the truth that no amount of crucifixions could erase. That freedom, once glimpsed, can never be fully extinguished. Spartacus's body may have been lost, but his death was never forgotten. And perhaps that is the truest victory of all. For Rome, with all its might, could destroy a man, but it could not destroy the terror of his defiance. That terror lives still, echoing across centuries, reminding us that even the greatest empires tremble before the will of the free.